Well, good morning, and welcome to the American Enterprise Institute. I am Ken Pollack. I am a senior fellow here in the Foreign and Defense Policy Program, and I am absolutely delighted to be moderating this event with General Kenneth Frank McKenzie Jr. General McKenzie, as I'm sure many of you know, had a long and distinguished, a 43-year career in the U.S. Marine Corps. General McKenzie culminated his career as the 16th commander of U.S. Central Command, where he was involved in any number of Arabian adventures during the course of his time there. And he is now the author of a fantastic new book, The Melting Point, Command and War in the 21st Century. He is also, at this time, the executive director for the Global and National Security Institute at the University of South Florida. General McKenzie, welcome to AEI.
It's great to be here today, Ken. Thanks for having me.
I want to start first just by complimenting you. Over the course of the last year or so, I've read at least a dozen books written by former four-star generals, and most of them had ghostwriters write those books. None of them can hold a candle to yours. It is such a lovely book. It is so well written. And I got an enormous amount from the book in terms of just the information that you conveyed, the stories that you told, the insights that you share. I mean, it's fantastic. But there were any number of occasions where I just stopped and said, that is such a beautiful sentence. Right? That is so gorgeously crafted, and it's such a rarity to find a former four-star who, not only can think, not only is in full command of his subject, but can express himself so beautifully. So on behalf of readers everywhere, thank you for that.
Ken, thanks. I enjoyed writing it. I like writing. It's a release on a number of different levels for me, but it was a work of pleasure and love.
Outstanding. And just to let everybody know, as you probably can see, at the end, General McKenzie has graciously agreed to stick around and sign books for those of you who'd like to do so. But let's plunge in, and we've got a lot to cover because your book deals with so many really important and worthwhile topics, both stuff in the news today, because obviously U.S. Central Command, where you were not only with a commander, but you were the Marine component commander. You had a whole variety of different iterations in the CENTCOM AOR. So there's a lot of stuff that's very topical, but there's also a lot that's bigger than that deals with our nation and its armed forces. And I'd love to cover a number of different topics with you if we're able to do so. But let's start with the topical, right? And obviously, the big issue right now, the big issue burning in your old AOR is the Gaza war. And while I think everybody here would be delighted to have you say whatever you want to about anything related to the Gaza war, I wanted to ask you, again, a slightly bigger question, because you obviously deal a lot with the strategic issues in the Middle East, the military balance, the questions of where warfare is headed. When you look at the Gaza war, as you've been paying attention to it over the course of the last 8 months, what surprised you about the Gaza war?
So, first of all, the fact that Hamas was able to achieve tactical, operational, and strategic surprise, given the depth and complexity of the Israeli security apparatus. I was a little surprised at that. It's not the first time they've been surprised. 73, they were surprised as well, although it's a little more, it's nuanced. I mean, they sort of knew, and it's a little more complex than just saying they were surprised. But Hamas was able to achieve surprise, and they were able to achieve surprise because they largely cut out from actual detailed attack planning, in my judgment, the Iranians, Lebanese Hezbollah, and other entities, because if they had talked to them about final stage attack planning, we would have known. I'll leave it there. We would have known. So that leads to what I think is a larger issue, and it's a little bit of a surprise, is how little support there has been for Hamas from Lebanese Hezbollah, ultimately, and really from Iran as well. Houthis are another matter. We can talk about them in just a moment. But Lebanese Hezbollah has not chosen to enter the fight at scale. And if they chose to enter it, as you know, they're the largest non-state military entity in the world. If they chose to come in, they could They could be putting 150 missiles an hour over downtown Tel Aviv, tens of thousands of missiles, very accurate, very capable missiles. Instead, it's a low-grade back and forth up across the northern border that may yet get larger. I don't know, but they chose not to come in. And for a variety of reasons, but I think principally because LH, Lebanese Hezbollah, and Nasrallah, the leader of Lebanese Hezbollah, won't come in unless they see the opportunity for strategic victory. Do they share a vision of the destruction of Israel? Absolutely. And they're very happy to see Hamas doing what they're doing. But there's also a coolness between Hamas and LH that we should just recognize. And LH was cut out of the plan at the last minute. So I think for LH to come into this fight, sort of three things would have to happen. I think in my own mind, as Nasrallah contemplates the situation, he's sort of got three checks in the box. One, he would have to believe that he has an opportunity for a strategic win. That would bring him in. Israel would have to be so bogged down in Gaza that they would have to denude the north and weaken the north. That has not obtained. That condition does not exist. Second, he would have to believe that internal Israeli governmental politics would so fracture the government that they would have trouble mounting a large-scale response against him. And despite all the problems in Israeli politics, that condition doesn't obtain. And the third condition would be that Israel is so isolated on the international stage, people won't help Israel if he attacks. And Israel is increasingly isolated on the international stage, but that condition doesn't obtain either. Additionally, in Lebanon, Nasrallah is weaker than he's been in a long time because the Lebanese economy is in the tank. And despite their best attempts to deflect it, LH bears some responsibility for that. And the second thing is the Lebanese government is unable to govern effectively for a variety of reasons, gridlock, the confessional nature of the government that you're well aware of. So, and I think even for something as something like the Beirut port blast of several years ago, LH is still blamed in parts of Lebanon, parts of Beirut for that, even though they didn't cause it, their negligence contributed to it, and I've actually overflown that explosion in Beirut, in the Beirut harbor. It looks like a nuclear weapon went off there. And so it's a huge explosion. So for all those reasons, they have not chosen to come in. And that's important. Not necessarily a surprise, but I think significant. Could they come in? Yes, they could. So anything can happen here, either through miscalculation, and over 80,000 Israelis have been forced to flee north, so Israel may have to make some decisions about what they're going to do up north. But right now, LH has not chosen to come in, nor has Iran, actually. And all the activities that are going on against Israel, the attack at Nebatim, that is actually, in my judgment, not related to the Gaza war, but rather to a shadow war that's been fought for several years between Israel and Iran across the theater, and Iran's been outfought in that war, culminating in the 1 April strike on IRGC planners in Damascus, the Iranian strike on Israel, which was not a messaging attack, but was a maximum effort by Iran to reset the balance, and we can talk in detail about that in a minute. Israel's response was actually nuanced and reasonable, and so we'll see how that goes from there. But the point I would make is not coming in to support Hamas. Now, the Houthis, yes, the true believers down in Yemen, they're in all the way, but they cannot effectively target Israel. They're good. Actually, the Houthis are very good aeronautical engineers. They take good weapons that come to them from Iran. They make them better and very effective. But they can't gain the volume they need to go against Iron Dome, Iron Beam, David Sling, Patriot, Israeli air defense, all the things that defend Israel. So they can close the Strait of Hormuz. They can close the Bab el-Mandeb, which effectively closes the Suez Canal. So they're the only group in the region that's actually supportive of Hamas in a demonstrable, aggressive way. That's the other strategic level surprise from the campaign. Not surprise, but observation from the campaign.
Let's pick up on that last, because you have a great section of the book that I really enjoyed. And again, coming from a former CENTCOM commander, it's really interesting to hear you talking about the future of warfare, cyber war, smart weaponry, how it's changing things, and to kind of get a feel for how a theater commander looks at that and kind of projects out into the future where things may be going, and then has to try to advise the political leadership on, hey, you need to be thinking about this. This is going to change. Here's what I may need in the future. When you look at the Gaza war, as you pointed out, we've seen a lot of new stuff, right? And some new stuff that has succeeded and some new stuff that has fizzled. You mentioned the Iranian strike on, I guess it was April 14, I think it was, right before tax day, it's my memory. Not sure that had any relationship to it, but yeah, it was a great big goose egg. But obviously, the simple fact that they could and would try it was interesting and unusual. And cyber seems to be the dog that isn't barking in all this. So as you look at the Gaza war, as you look at all the different things that are going on, again, what struck you about it? What should we take away from this? And feel free, to tell us about the future Middle East balance, or about where the United States ought to be thinking about in terms of its own defense.
So let me actually, let's talk a little bit about the Iranian attack on Israel. So again, Iran launched the attack because they've been outfought in the shadow war. So I believe they took a page from the Russian playbook, escalate to de-escalate. If you don't like the terms of the game you're in, you raise the stakes dramatically by doing something that sets your opponent back on his heels a little bit. So he's got to recalculate. Do I want to be in the game at this level? Do I want to adjust? Now the problem the Iranians have is the Russians can play that card because they're the Russians, and they have a nuclear arsenal of uncontested strength that we know and understand. The Iranians actually use what I would call their crown jewels, their ballistic missiles, their drones, and their land attack cruise missiles. And I would argue those are actually the crown jewels of Iran, even more so than the nuclear program, which I don't deprecate, but Iran chose to employ those in a massive attack. And it was not a signaled attack. It was not a measured attack. It was a maximum effort. And so, okay, Iran's got thousands of missiles. Why only 300? Iran has probably 1,000 missiles, more or less, that can reach Tel Aviv. But they have a throughput problem. They got to get the missiles out of storage and put them on tractor erector launchers, or what we call TELs. They got, for sake of argument, we'll say 150 TELs. The actual number doesn't matter. And so that's as many as you can generate in a volley. Then you got to go back and get more missiles. That takes time. So they launched as many as they could against Nevatim, and they coupled it with what they thought, and I had thought would be the way you do it. You proceed it or sequence it with your drones. The drones ideally go in and take out your Patriot radars, your Iron Dome radars, the sensors. Because if the Patriot doesn't have a radar, it's just a piece of iron sitting on a rail. They were unable to do that. And the attack failed for several reasons. First of all, because what we're seeing in the region, and I think this is a key way forward in the region, what that attack on Israel was a demonstration for the first time of a collective architecture for integrated air and missile defense in the Middle East. And that was a dream when I was a brand new general working for Jim Mattis at CENTCOM in 2010. Right. He had a dream of collective security architecture focused on Iran. Well, the Gulf nations wouldn't buy it. We could never get buy-in. A guy named Dave Goldfein, who went on to be Chief of Staff of the Air Force, was the Air Force Central Commander. I went to conference after conference with him in the region. We could never get the Gulf states, and by the Gulf states, I mean Saudi Arabia, UAE, Oman to a degree, Qatar to a degree, and Bahrain to buy into the idea that we should collectively approach defending against the threat from Iran of missiles and airplanes and other things. No buy-in. So what's changed since 2010 to now? First of all, the imminence of the Iranian threat. Since 2010, the Iranian ballistic missile force has gotten much better, more accurate, more capable. Their drones arguably are among the best in the world. As you know, they send lots of them to Russia, which tests them, and they get results back from those tests. And their land attack cruise missiles are very good. So they have poured lots of money into that program. And again, I would argue that's their crown jewel. It's really the core capability they have, because they can employ that this afternoon against their neighbor, not a year and a half in the future with some putative nuclear weapon that may or may not be developed and be deliverable. So that capability has grown. The nations have seen that. At the same time, they've gotten more concerned about whether or not the United States is going to be a stable, dependable partner in the region. They're concerned about what we bring. At the same time, they value the relationship with us because they know our capabilities. The Combined Air Operations Center at Al Dhafra Air Base, just south of Doha, is sort of the nerve center for air defense in the theater. And it's other places too, but that's the place that we'll talk about today. So people know and understand the capabilities we bring. They know and understand the capabilities Israel brings to the fight. So several things happen. You have the Iranian attack on Abacut, on the Saudi oil fields in September 2019. Iran still doesn't claim attribution for that, but I think reasonable people can agree that it's probably Iran that did that attack, not the Houthis. That scared the Saudis because it exposed grave weaknesses in their defense and their ability to protect themselves. and other various attacks that Iran's carried on during this period, all tended to focus attention on Iran. So the Abraham Accords bring Israel into the region diplomatically. Israel comes into the region in January 2021 as a member of Central Command. They come in as a nation state inside CENTCOM. They had been in European Command for many decades for reasons that we can go into if anyone's interested, but we brought them in. I proposed that. Secretary Esper bought into it, made the idea his own, argued it, took it across the river. President Trump signed it about 10 days before he left office. Big deal coming in. What that allowed me to do then was, in the fall of 2021 and the spring of 2022, I was able to convene conferences of chiefs of defense. And I did this at Sharm el-Sheikh at the southern end of the Sinai Peninsula with the Israeli chief of defense, the Saudi chief of defense, and other chiefs of defense across the region. And given the changing nature of the threat, the imminence of the threat from Iran, the recognition that the United States and Israel had capabilities that they needed, everyone ultimately acts from a sense of self-interest. We shouldn't be ashamed to recognize that. They want what we've got, and they know that Iran is their major threat. So as a result of that, we worked out, and these meetings were not simply where we went, had dinner, took a picture. Hundreds of staff hours were put into preparing for the meetings. So when we met, we talked about tactics, techniques, and procedures for air defense and missile defense in the region. Because if nations in the region are obsessed with sovereignty and air and missile defense, you don't give up much sovereignty because you're sharing information. Nobody's basing forces in your country. You're not basing forces in someone else's country. What you're doing is you're building what we would call a common operational picture, or a COP. You're sharing tactics, techniques, and procedures for how to defend against an Iranian attack. And we saw a textbook perfect application of that in the Iranian attack on Israel, where you had nations shared early warning, tipping and queuing was shared, it was processed. We were able to operate, Israel, United States, and Saudis were operated over Saudi airspace, over Jordanian airspace, possibly over other countries as well, and the Iranian attack failed. That is a huge event going forward. It's going to be a historical event. And what happened, a week later was often Israeli responses to attacks like this are very heavy-handed. The Iranian response in this case was deft, technologically, it's technological legerdemain, if you will. They apply. The Iranians still don't know exactly what happened to them, except that Israeli aircraft, or what they believe were Israeli aircraft, and other platforms operated over their nuclear sites for a period of time and struck targets. They could have struck other targets. They could have come back the next night. And the beauty of that was they didn't go to downtown Tehran and raise 7 city blocks, which they could have done, but would have pushed the neighbors away. It would have made it harder for Saudi to continue to cooperate with Israel, would have made it harder for Jordan, for a variety of nations to buy into that. And it would have made it harder for the United States as well, just based on statements that we've seen from our own government. So the Israeli response is pretty smart. So that coalition, if you will, I don't want to oversell it, but that coalition going forward is, I think, very important to defending against the principal threat in the region, which I would argue is Iran, and its missile threat, its drone threat, and its land attack cruise missile threat. So the takeaway from that is, I think further normalization of ties between Saudi Arabia, Israel, and other Arab nations is going to happen. I can't speak to the pace. Gaza is a factor in that. You're all aware of that. But I don't think it will prevent it because the threat is Iran. And if you're looking at the future of Saudi Arabia, the one thing you don't have in Saudi Arabia is the virtue of distance, which Israel enjoys because Saudi Arabia is largely between Israel and Iran. So you're much closer to Iran. So you've got a more difficult tactical problem. But nonetheless, there are things you can learn from this relationship, TTPs you can apply. All of that tend to contribute to the defense of the nations in the region. So if I were going to talk about the way forward in the region, I think, and so what the president is trying to do, I think is commendable. We'll see if it works out. Mm-hmm. I don't know if we're going to be able to, I'm not a political expert. I don't know if we're going to be able to get the votes in the Senate for some form of a mutual defense pact with Saudi Arabia. I just don't know the answer to that. I do know, at least from my perspective, and if I were giving advice, anything like that would have to include explicit assurances about recognition of Israel. If I were giving advice, I would give that advice. So we'll see what happens, but I think, and as usual, the Iranians have brought this on themselves by their activities. So I'll pause there. I don't want to keep talking forever, but that's sort of if I were to look at it strategically, that's the conclusion I would draw right now.
So I think that's great. Let's stick with Iran, because I think that we've barely touched the tip of the iceberg with Iran. And again, you've great discussions of Iran throughout the book because it's a recurrent theme during your entire time at CENTCOM and fixes itself into so many different issues that you wanted to address. Tell us a little bit more about how you see the Iranian threat, how we are dealing with it, how we should be. In particular, you have a fabulous discussion about the two forms of deterrence, deterrence by denial, deterrence by punishment, how we've mostly taken a deterrence by denial approach with Iran. Is that the right approach? Should we take it wherever you'd like?
Sure. So when we talk about Iran, I think the one thing we need to recognize is Iran is a culture going back thousands of years. It's not going to go away. It's going to be a force in the region for the foreseeable future. Now, we can all deplore the current theocratic form of government, what they do to their people, what do they do to their friends or their neighbors in the region. All that, malign, aggressive, certainly that's not the Iran we want to see going forward. But the nation state itself is not going to go away. We're not going to get rid of it with a maximum pressure campaign. We're not going to get rid of it with diplomatic pressure. It's something we're going to have to deal with. So Iran has, in my judgment, three objectives. Three. You can characterize Iranian foreign policy and defense policy in three things. Number one, and above all, protection of the regime. Iran views itself as a revolutionary society, a revolutionary state, and all revolutions want to preserve the revolution into the second generation. They know from a study of history it's hard to do that. The Russians weren't able to do it. The French weren't able to do it. You got successor states to those revolutions that look very different than what the revolutionary generations envisioned. So protection of the regime, ensuring regime stability is objective number one for Iran. And that's why when people talk about protests in Iran as a way to change Iran, I'm not optimistic about that because this regime will go to genocidal lengths to protect regime stability. The fact they haven't done that, and there've just been smaller killings, frankly, is because they haven't felt the need to do it. But they will go to whatever lengths are necessary to preserve the regime. So that's objective number one. Objective number two remains the destruction of the state of Israel. Objective number three is the ejection of the United States from the region. Now there are some internal objectives as well, but I'm not going to discuss those. So objectives 2 and 3 might change order, like number 3 might become number 2, number 2, number 3, depending on the year, depending on what's going on. But objective 1 is never going to be challenged. That's why Iran is actually susceptible to deterrence. It is possible to deter Iran because they are rational actors within their worldview. But that worldview is protection of the regime as the primary overarching objective of what they want to do. So therefore, you threaten the regime, you can gain leverage against them. You can also get them to sometimes react very aggressively. But there are ways to deter Iran. Iran actually respects the use of force. They know and understand it. And I said this in a Wall Street Journal op-ed a few months ago. It's like Lenin and his dictum, if you stick a bayonet into mush, you keep pushing the bayonet. If you reach steel, you stop and you pull the bayonet out. That's sort of the way the Iranians approach it. They know and understand when force is applied to them. They understand what the Israelis would call the dialogue of targets, if you will, that goes on across the region. When we choose not to set and enforce red lines against Iran, we actually encourage Iranian misbehavior, and they will be more aggressive. I will point to the latter stages of our war in Iraq, where Qasem Soleimani brought explosively formed penetrators into the fight and killed hundreds of U.S. soldiers and Marines. We never actually responded firmly to that, so they continued to kill soldiers and Marines. But had we done something very aggressive then, it's possible that could have stopped. But we chose not to do that. Same thing, what led up to the cycle of escalation that culminated in the death of Qasem Soleimani in early January 2020. We had an opportunity to stop that earlier, and that opportunity, in my judgment, was when the Iranians shot down our RQ-4, which is a big, unarmed Navy patrol drone flying at 40,000 feet, jet-powered, over our side of the Strait of Hormuz. An Iranian low-level commander made a decision to shoot it down because their command and control is very rickety. And we had an opportunity then to respond. And we did not, ultimately we didn't respond. There are a lot of reasons for that I go into in the book, and I won't lay them out now. But had we did some low-level cyber stuff. But had we responded aggressively then, it is possible that we would have not gotten into the cycle of escalation that took us into the fall, the attacks on Saudi Arabia, ultimately the attacks on our forces in Iraq and Syria, the attacks on the embassy in late December, culminating in the strike on Qasem Soleimani. It is possible we would have gone, it's a counterfactual, we'll never know. But with a state like Iraq, and the same thing I would add with the Houthis right now, you act aggressively early, you can stop it. If you choose to manage the problem, typically the problem ends up managing you at the end.
Great point. I want to bring in a couple more actors who complicated the situation in the Middle East. Russia, China, North Korea. Russia's got kind of a quasi-alliance with Iran. China and North Korea, a little bit more difficult to characterize, but certainly being unhelpful in terms of the relationship with Iran. How do you see that changing? What we do in the region, what Iran does, the entire strategic balance there?
So, Russia operating from a small economic base, a lot of problems, but has a stellar nuclear capability that we've already talked about, and actually makes some very good weapon systems. Came into Syria early in the Syrian civil war for several different reasons. First of all, it's one of their few, maybe their only client state abroad. They wanted to reassert the right to a warm water anchorage in the Mediterranean, which never concerned me. There was a warm water anchorage at Latakia throughout the Cold War. It never bothered us then. We just know where their submarines are, which will be useful if we got to do something. So not a big deal actually. But it allowed him also to assert himself on the global stage as an actor. Allowed him to throw sand in our gearbox of the things we were trying to do in Syria. And I would argue, and when they went in the back of Putin's mind, he might have thought he could use it as a bargaining chip for Crimea. Ultimately down the road. It didn't work out like that, but I reject the assertion that the Russians are skilled chess players who see 7 moves ahead. It was an act of pure opportunism, maybe 1 move ahead, maybe not even 1 move. Let's do this and see what happens. So Russia's in the region, and they play a role in Syria. They play a very limited role in the rest of the region because just people prefer U.S. equipment. Russian terms are onerous. They can't generate it, and they don't have the money to actually work in the theater very effectively. They can't maintain a significant naval presence east of Eden, south of the Suez, and into the east because they don't have a navy that can do that. So that's sort of the Russian issue. Now with Iran, a little different. That's a marriage of pure convenience. Russia's running into significant problems equipping the force that's fighting in Ukraine. Their industrial base can't keep up with it, which is why they're digging into older and older tanks, older and older armored vehicles. And Iran, and it is a war in which drones are figuring large. Iran builds good drones, so Iran sells the drones to Russia. Russia's employing them, I think, with pretty good effect in that war. Although, drones on the battlefield, it's a constant battle between offense and defense, and we can talk about that in just a minute. But Russia's employing them. So what's Iran getting for that? I think Iran is getting technological access. I think Iran is getting, I believe that with some indication they're getting some surveillance technology from Russia that they're using probably internally. There's talk of them getting Russian fighters. And I would just say as an aside, we should encourage the Iranians to buy those fighters. They will never fly them properly, and we'll shoot them down. It's just like, many years ago when Venezuela was talking about buying Russian submarines, we should have encouraged that. It would have been great. So spend all your money on Russian submarines. If you're the Iranians, bring some Russian fighters down there. The fighters they have now, they can't fly. Spare parts will be a challenge. Maintenance will be a challenge. It'll be a nightmare for them. But let them discover that at their own pace and their own time. But nonetheless, it is I would argue, it's purely a marriage of convenience. And it will not survive in the long term because they don't have enough common interests in order to do that. North Korea, sort of the same thing. It's technology transfers back and forth. I think more to Iran than from Iran to North Korea, although drones may be an interesting thing. Just hard to do those technology transfers sometimes with North Korea because of the regime sanctions. A little easier between Iran and Russia just because geographically and other things. China has long-term vision in the theater. They want to be in the region. Half their hydrocarbons come through not the Suez Canal, but the Strait of Hormuz. So not unusual that China should be interested in the region. But I would argue that all the talk about the China brokered rapprochement between Saudi and Iran, I don't recall much happening since that event occurred. And I don't think much will because China doesn't have the cards to play to do it. They will become an increasing force in the region, economically and then ultimately militarily. They have a base at Djibouti. There's talk of other bases perhaps. And I would predict they'll enter through Pakistan and move from there. But again, China, I don't think at this time is interested in deploying significant military forces into the region. That could change over time.
That's terrific stuff, General. And God, I wish we had more time with you because I'd love to dig into all of this stuff. But there's one last big element of your book that I really want to talk about, and that is these issues of leadership and civil-military relations, which are also a major theme of the book. Right. And I just think are hugely important, given where the country is now, where we may be headed after the next election. You just have, obviously, you tell any number of great stories in the book. And inevitably, many of those stories touch on these issues of civil-military relations. So I'd love it if you'd start by just giving us, tell us a little bit about what you've seen during your 43 years in terms of what good civil-military relations looks like and what bad civil-military relations looks like.
Sure. So let me actually describe, when you're a combatant commander, you're a 4-star. There are 11 combatant commanders in the United States. 7 are geographic, they own a part of the earth. 4 are functional, space, cyber, special operations command, et cetera. But when you're a 4-star combatant commander, you have 2 bosses only in the world. And those 2 bosses are the President of the United States and the Secretary of Defense. So the chain of command, which is the way things happen in the U.S. military, goes from the President to the Secretary to the combatant commander. The Chairman of the Joint Chiefs is not in the chain of command. I speak as a former director of the Joint Staff. I know as much about this as anybody in the world. So the chairman is the senior military advisor to the president and to the secretary. And he is, by custom, tradition, and law, the senior military officer of the United States. However, he or she is not in the chain of command, can't initiate an order. The orders have to come in the path I've just described. Now, the chairman is going to be part of that. He's going to give advice, but only one person gives advice, but as a junior partner. I've been present in a lot of policy debates. Sometimes I'm not there. Frequently I was there. You get an opportunity to give advice, but then when the meeting's over and you have a decision, only one person walks out of that room with a requirement to execute the task. So lots of people give advice. Lots of people execute the tasks. Only the combatant commander does both. And that's my principal exposure to civ-mil relations. And the point I'd make is this. It's very important in the United States that final decisions are made by civilians and the constitutionally appropriate authority. We never want to be in a situation where a general can weigh in and say, I don't agree with that. The Uniform Code of Military Justice is very clear. You got to follow the orders you're given unless the order is illegal. It can be immoral and you got to execute it. It can be religiously distasteful to you. It can go against all of your very best screaming instincts that this is stupid, and you got to do it unless it's illegal. At Central Command, I had 14 lawyers that were happy to give me advice on what a legal order was and wasn't. On the other hand, I actually know what a legal order is and isn't. And so in 42 years, 10 months, 5 days of service, I never got a legal order. And you are obligated to not obey an illegal order. But the law is very clear. It's not as fuzzy as you might think. You know what an illegal order is when you see it. It's very clear to you. So that's an important point. So, and the other thing I would add is, look, any president has the right to make a wrong decision, and he has a right to see a wrong decision executed by the U.S. military. And if we want to address that wrong decision, there are ways to address that wrong decision. None of them involve the U.S. military. Mm-hmm. And it will be a bad day for this republic if ever people wonder what the U.S. military thinks about it. The U.S. military has tried very hard throughout my entire career to be apolitical. I was proud of being apolitical. I gave direct personal advice to 2 presidents and was in the room for others as a backbencher, but I was directly in the arena with 2 of them. And regardless of party, regardless of outlook, they got my best advice. I took their orders and I executed their orders because they were legal orders. And so that's an important part. Now look, over in the Pentagon, the civ-mil relationship can get a little tense because now you're talking to the secretary. He's got a policy shop of civilians that are going to give advice, and that may at times conflict with the advice I was given as the commander or the joint staff is giving, because the joint staff, again, I was director of that staff, it's a very good staff, and they're going to arm the chairman for these debates. So you get debates about policy, and ultimately the guy or gal that's got to make that call is the secretary. The way our system works, it all comes together in the person of the Secretary of Defense. So the fact that you disagree is not bad at all. The fact that you violently disagree is not bad at all, so long as the secretary, we all agree, the secretary is going to make the final decision. We're going to walk out of the room and execute the task that the secretary has given us. So I had the opportunity to be part of decisions I agreed with and to be part of decisions I didn't agree with. But in all cases, the importance of civilian control, in my view, is more important than the decision. So I never thought about resigning. First of all, for the reasons I've spent a little time talking about here. I occasionally thought about resigning for other reasons, but not because I didn't like the way the decision had gone down. And there were decisions that I think all of you are aware that I didn't agree with. So from my perspective, that's absolutely vital. And the principal person, though, who protects that is the chairman. He's not in the chain of command, but he's the visible face of the U.S. military. And we've had two chairmen, General Milley, General Dunford, who were both very good at it. I'm sure if need be, General C.Q. Brown, my good friend, former Chief of Staff of the Air Force, now the chairman, he'll be very good at it. But it's vital that the military remain apolitical and it be perceived to be apolitical. That's a fundamental tenet of, I think, the way forward for this republic.
Outstanding. By the way, in about 10 minutes, I'm going to come to the audience for questions, so be thinking about what you might want to ask. But, John, I want to follow up on that. Tell me, to what extent do you think that we need to do better on civil-military relations? And to the extent that we do, what should we be thinking about, right? Are there things that the Congress could do to fix it? Do we need another Goldwater Nichols? Is it about things that the military could be doing, things that the commander-in-chief should be thinking about? How do we make things better if we need to?
So, I think at the highest levels, we're okay. We understand it. The policies are clear regardless. I think it really comes down to how you interact at the departmental level inside the Department of Defense. How, when men and women come into the policy shop, how are they prepared and trained to be civilians that are ultimately going to have an unequal and stronger voice in what happens against a joint staff and combatant commanders who, look, no four-star and there's no crisis of confidence with me. There's no inner monologue of inadequacy going on here. So I'm very confident in my assertions. That doesn't mean they're right. But I'm happy to argue those assertions, and I'm happy to argue them vigorously with anybody. So if you're going to come into a policy argument with me, you need to be prepared for that argument. I'm prepared by very, very smart people, colonels, lieutenant colonels, men and women who, I was a planner by trade. So I went to Marine Command and Staff College, and then I spent an entire second year at the School of Advanced Warfighting learning about the operational art. You're okay with, when you finish 2 years of study of that, you're okay with how to conduct military planning and then how to actually express it. I also had the opportunity to work as a year and a half for the smartest human being I've ever worked for in the flesh, and that was a woman named Michelle Flournoy. And she's a former Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. I worked for her as a fellow before she went to that job. And that's where I learned the ins and outs of policy formulation and how to actually talk and compete in that environment. But so what I would say is we have a structured program of education. There's no structured program of education on the civilian side. So I did not think of this, and I can't remember the person who wrote it, but let's say someone's coming into the Department of Defense to be a Deputy Assistant Secretary for something in defense. They're coming off Capitol Hill. They work on a staff, maybe on a committee or maybe in a congressional office directly, but there are probably one or two things they're very deep on, they're very good on. Those are their things. And they want to come over to defense and talk those things. Well, a DASD is going to manage 40 or 50 things. And those two things that are important to that DASD before they come over to the building may not be important to the assistant secretary or the undersecretary or the big secretary. So when you come in, the department has its business to be done. Military guy, I know that because I've come up in that. But if you dip in and out, sometimes you come in, and then I'm used to management. People are used to leading large organizations. As a 4-star general, I had 9 direct reports, 3-star generals. And let me tell you, that's a tough audience to talk to. So I'm used to talking to people that bring vast cultural and intellectual baggage into the room when they talk and are very confident in their opinions as well. And I did that as a lieutenant colonel, as a colonel, up through the steps. So when you sit down in the room, high degree of confidence with the men and women wearing uniforms. On the other side, sometimes not so much. I would argue we need to fix that. We need to better train people to come into policy. And I don't think you do that by placing a litmus test on whether they signed a pledge against the president or not. And that makes a lot of talent off limits if you do that. Right. But there are great people in the department. I never want to give you the impression that's not the case. But I do think we would benefit from a more formal, structured approach to how we educate them. Maybe maybe you need to look at some equivalent to the National War College. So, the National War College actually does have civilians attend it, but in very small number. You might look at more civilians there, although I think it is probably too narrow for what they want. You might need another approach. Look, it's a constant problem, but it's not the quality of the people. The people are great. Rather, it's the background and training they bring to the task they're given.
So that's terrific. And I'm glad that you actually said that there isn't a course for civilians.
No, there's not. There's nothing.
Because I was afraid when I got to the NSC that I just missed it somewhere along the line. Glad to hear that. It just
you learn as you go, and often that learning can be without a state tuition.
Yeah, and on the job, unfortunately. So I want to ask you the flip side to that as well. Because again, there are lots of people out there who are concerned about the state of our civil-military relations. And my experience of government is, God help us when we identify a problem, because often the things we do to fix it are worse than what we had to begin with. So what should we not do to fix civil-military relations? What would make it worse? I mean, I said, do we need another Goldwater-Nichols? Would that be a terrible idea? Should we keep the Congress out of it? What comes to your mind?
So at various times, there's been discussion of putting the chairman in the chain of command. We looked at that right after the Second World War. The fact of the matter is the American people don't want a commanding general of the nation's armies. They don't want that. The last time we had that was really, you almost have to go back to the Civil War when you had that kind of principle in action. The American people don't want it. The Congress doesn't want it. And so I think it's very important. So looking at the ways you might further organize the military, and people say, well, the chairman's too strong. We need to weaken the chairman. The chairman's not in the chain of command now.
Right.
So I would argue that the discussion of a civ-mil rift, a 7 days in May kind of scenario, is vastly overblown. And I speak as someone who was the director of the Joint Staff J5, so I got a little knowledge of it. So you might disagree with me, but I think you have to respect the fact that I've been in the mix a while, and I do know it. And I think that's important. But so I don't know. I don't think you need another Goldwater-Nichols. I actually think Goldwater-Nichols works pretty well. I'm of the view that you come up in the service, you become specialized in whatever you're doing. I was an infantryman, but at some point, if you're going to rise to flag rank and go on, you got to go to the joint world. And we don't need to push jointness down. Jointness is at about the right level right now. But I think Goldwater-Nichols, and here's the thing, people don't remember this, the services fought Goldwater-Nichols to the death, and it was wholly imposed by civilian leadership.
Right.
The services and the Joint Staff fought it to the bitter end. The Navy actually today doesn't recognize it. So the Navy, they're the last holdout.
Right.
And they like to pretend occasionally that it doesn't exist. And by that I'm talking about when it comes to officer education and the way they prepare their officers for senior leadership. Sometimes the Navy chooses not to recognize that. But that is an example of an externally derived, congressionally driven fix that nobody wanted, but that worked real well. So there is a place for that. I would just argue that, I would say, first of all, no organization can reform itself. It has to be done externally. But I don't recognize a need for reform right now. I think we're doing okay.
That's terrific. And before I go to questions, I can't resist telling a little story of my own quickly about the Navy, which was back when I was at CIA and I was over at the Pentagon briefing a whole bunch of people with birds and stars on their shoulders. And afterwards, and I don't remember what that guy was talking about, but a 3-star general, Army general, took me aside afterwards, and I don't know what was wrong, but he said to me, son, you're real smart and all that, and that was a good briefing, but you don't understand a very fundamental problem that we have. And I was like, what's that, General? He said, you need to understand that the United States Navy is a separate, independent, and mostly hostile nation bordering the United States on 3 sides. But okay, I'll try to keep that in mind for the future, General. Terrific stuff. All right, let me go to the audience. And what I'd like to do, because our time's a little bit limited, and as you can see, General McKenzie is a wealth of knowledge and has thought about this stuff incredibly deeply. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to take maybe 3 questions at a time. Hopefully we can get to a couple of rounds and bring it to General McKenzie, and then, General, you can pick and choose, answer whatever you like to, take it wherever you want to. So I'll call on people. Please do raise your hand, and do wait for the mic, because don't we have a mic? No? Yeah, we do have a mic. Okay. So why don't we start in the back, ma'am? Got two
Kathy
mics. Thanks,
Fagali. I have a question about Hassan Nasrallah and Hezbollah, Lebanon. Why hasn't he been assassinated? I mean, it looks like a lot of the top people are being knocked off, and Hassan Nasrallah seems immune. And then I have another question about him. Is there any truth to the story that he was identified by Iranian scouts years ago as a youth and taken to Iran to be educated there, to become fluent in Farsi and Iranian culture in the Shiite way, and sent back and forth between Lebanon and Iran so he could hold a future leadership position?
Okay, hold on for a second. Let's take a few
Good
more.
to see you.
Can I say Benham? Cat, that's fine. Cat, take this gentleman in the gray, and then we'll come to Benham in the front.
Good morning, General. I would like to hear your thoughts in terms of the civ-mil dialogue and the unequal relationship. From your perspective, has there been a positive or negative effect of the last two administrations, current and the last administration, in hiring former four-stars as the Secretary of Defense? Thank you.
Okay.
So, take the gentleman in the tan jacket, Ben. Good.
Thank you very much, General. Benham Ben Talablu, Senior Fellow at FDD, covering Iran. Quick question on, do we have to fear success more than failure in the Middle East? Sometimes the short-term military success requires the adversary to punch back. Are we prepared for some of those? I'm thinking the post-Soleimani strike, the post-Abraham Accords Middle East, and potentially post what comes in Gaza, as well as another short question on Russia-Iran space cooperation. Burns mentioned that was something, but obviously there's limited public information. Do you see that as something evolving in the future? Thank you.
Okay. Take it away, General.
Sure. So let me actually talk the SecDef question first and civ-mil relations. I think civ-mil relations have been battered a bit by both administrations, the last two administrations. I think it's a convenient punching bag for a lot of people. I think as a general principle, you don't want a retired four-star officer as your Secretary of Defense. I think that my view is across the arc of really post-World War II American history, United States history, the president is better served by a political person in that job. You don't need a military expert to be the Secretary of Defense. You need a political expert to be the Secretary of Defense. The Deputy Secretary is going to run the department. You've got a chairman that can give you advice on all the technical stuff. So I would even argue that somebody like McNamara might not have been a great choice. Who came, I would say better is, and for a lot of reasons, some were only available in retrospect, but I really think you're better with a political figure in that position. That's just my opinion. And as you know, it requires a waiver to take a four-star, and so I think that's a good principle, and the Senate should exercise its prerogative then. So the question about Nasrallah. So look, Nasrallah is probably the hardest target to hit in the Middle East. I have no opinion on whether or not guys have tried to hit him in the past.
You know that from personal?
Well, I know he's a hard guy to, he's hiding somewhere up there in Lebanon. I don't know about his prior relationship. I'm not an expert on that particular part of it. Was he educated in Iran, went to Iran? I would say this. I think Nasrallah will make decisions based on what's best for Nasrallah and Lebanese Hezbollah, not what is based on what's best for Iran. He will be, look, his equipment comes from Iran. Well, we all know there's powerful linkages there between them. I got that. I'm not denying that. I'm just saying when it's all said and done, LH will make their own decisions based on what happens to LH. They will not be pushed into a war with Israel by Iran. I don't think that's possible. I think he will resist that. Mm-hmm. But having said that, look, he shares clearly a goal with Iran, the destruction of Israel. I don't mean to minimize that or to couch it in any other terms but that. Great questions, and great to see you both again. The question about Iran and Russia. So Iran has a sort of nascent, uneven space program. I would still be of the opinion it's largely designed to give them experience in creating longer range missiles. I can't recall the last time they put something on orbit. But yeah, I would guess, and all I know is what I read in the New York Times, I would guess that they are getting help from the Russians in a variety of fields, and that's one of them. Because look, the thing, what Russia can't do, Russia doesn't have a lot of money. but Russia does have a lot of technical expertise, particularly in space operations. So I would be surprised if that's not being shared with Iran.
Very good.
Sure.
I'll take another round of questions, but I've actually got one from online. My
Okay.
colleague Danielle Pletka has texted me one for you.
Sure.
She's watching, one of the people online. Al-Udeid and Qatar. Qatar can be a troublesome partner. Al-Udeid, obviously the kind of forward headquarters of U.S. Central Command in the region. Give us your sense about the utility of Al-Udeid and about the relationship with the Qataris and balance all that out for us. And then let's, again, take a couple more questions. So we got some gentlemen here in the red cap.
Hi, Augustus Salzona, Asian, Filipino, Catholic American. I have a general question. Shouldn't the EU, especially Western Europeans instead of Americans, be paying their fair share of the Ukraine war and their Middle East misadventures since the earlier 20th century?
Let's go to this young lady in front here.
Hi, my name is Riley. I'm an intern here at AEI. And you were talking earlier about the Houthis and their role in the Gaza war specifically, and how they don't really have the infrastructure, the materials necessary to kind of have a tangible impact in that conflict specifically. But we still see a lot of issues coming from Houthis coming out of Yemen, instability domestically in Yemen, in the Red Sea. And so I would just like to hear some of your thoughts on some of the outside of the Gaza context issues that we might be having with the Houthis in Yemen. Sure.
So let me actually start with the Houthi question. So the Houthis have managed to shut down the Suez Canal. Ships aren't going through the Suez Canal. That's a huge problem for world commerce. It's a huge problem for the United States. And so we have said in our public pronouncements, we're gonna reopen the Bab el-Mandeb. We have not done that. And so who determines whether Maersk Sea Lines goes through the Bab el-Mandeb? Well, let me tell you who determines that. Lloyd's of London, the insurers. If you want to insure a ship, the United States can't make it sail through there. It's wholly market forces. So the Houthis have actually shut down a significant fraction of global commerce. What that does is it takes elastic out of the global shipping lanes. You got to go around South Africa. It requires more cost, more risk, more ships, more everything. And Egypt loses a significant fraction of their economy because nobody's going through the Suez Canal. So now, we said we're going to reopen it, and our statement about reopening wasn't related to the war in Gaza, but rather related to a larger principle that's fundamental to U.S. national security, the free right of passage on the high seas. And we are keenly interested in choke points, perhaps look into the Strait of Taiwan and what lessons others might derive from our actions here. So to date, our policy has proven completely ineffective, and in fact has made the Houthis larger than they were. I go back to a point I made earlier. If you're gonna, so we got an aircraft carrier steaming what we call modlock boxes up and down the Red Sea. Not the place you want to put an aircraft carrier. You got Burt-class destroyers playing catch against Houthi missiles, and the Houthis are very innovative. They launch a lot of missiles. They build a lot of missiles. So my question would be, what are we going to do here? And the United States is actually not the nation most affected by this. There are other nations that are, which sort of goes to your question a little bit. You would like to see perhaps other nations involved in this beyond, there are other nations involved, but there probably should be more nations involved in this effort against the Houthis. I would say of all the things going on in the region right now, that's the most obvious failure of the United States to actually find resolution for a conflict. And yeah, the Houthis, they took over the country in 2014, and the Iranians, I believe, actually didn't want them to take over the country. They wanted them to form an LH-type government there, keep the government of Yemen in place. The Houthis didn't get the memo. They're very aggressive. They took over, fought an ugly, bloody war against Saudi Arabia, fought an ugly, bloody war against Yemen. Questions of famine and humanitarian disaster is huge in Yemen. All of that in play, all of that largely because the Houthis are in charge and are not open to alternatives. So we have not forced them. So what we're going to do there, I don't know. It's still in front of us. But I think that's a significant problem. As to the question about, yes, I would like to see members of the EU do more. I would like to see them do more in Ukraine. I would like to see them do more in the Middle East. And those nations that are affected by what's happened in the Bab el-Mandeb should actually have ships out there. In a perfect world, you'd expect to see that. Good observation. The first question was about Qatar. So the principal, the headquarters of U.S. Central Command forward is at Al Udeid Air Base, about 50 miles south of Doha. It's a great place. The Qataris have spent a lot of money on that base for us. It's a fantastic facility. My forward headquarters was there. The Combined Air Operations Center is there. And it's great facilities. And obviously, Qatar, small state, but almost in practical terms, with infinite wealth. They're balancing between their need to be friendly with Iran because they share the South Pars oil field with Iran. They've got to look to, not oil field, natural gas field. They've got to maintain a reasonable relationship with them. We know their views. They've actually been supportive of Hamas. This is not a surprise. I'm not telling you new information. So what Qatar can do because of their vast wealth is they can triangulate their position, and they do that. And Al Udeid is just a hedge. It's just one of the many tools they use to hedge. The problem with Al Udeid, though, operationally as a commander is we went there when we were fighting a big war in Afghanistan, big war in Iraq. Iran was not the imminent, it was a threat, but it wasn't quite the threat it is now. The problem with Al Udeid is it's too close to Iran. You don't put your head, it's like in the American Civil War, Washington and Richmond, very close together. Ideally, you'd want your capitals deep in your own country, but they're very close together, which produce some effects as a result of that. Same thing here, you're too close to Iran. It's 6 or 7 minutes, well, less, ballistic missile flight to hit Al Udeid if the Iranians choose to launch against it. So that's a problem that we've got to address. And we have we think about ways to do that, which largely means you've got to think about basing in the western part of the theater because your airplanes are not going to survive sitting on the ramp at Al Udeid. You can go in and refuel there. You might base west, come east, bounce, gas up, arm up, go fight, come back, something like that. And the Air Force has got a concept for that called agile combat employment they can use in the Middle East and in the Pacific as well. But that's a problem. It's a growing problem. And all these bases, not only Al Udeid, but Al Dhafra in UAE, Manama in Bahrain, all of those bases are very, very close to Iran, which means you don't have to go far to fight, which means they don't have to go very far to fight either. So it's a double-edged sword.
Do you have a preferred locale for where the...
In general, you would like to be west in the theater, as far west as you can go, up and down the Red Sea, because that more time of flight, some of the advantages that we saw with the attack on Israel, you would gain then. So there are a variety of reasons why you'd prefer to have more standoff space for your aircraft.
Got it. So maybe somewhere right in the middle of Sinai Peninsula?
Probably, well, there are a lot of places out there that we've looked at. I mean, we stood up Prince Sultan Air Base, PSAB, after the September 2019 attack. Did that just to gain more standoff. If you look at it on the map, it's about in the center of the Arabian Peninsula. And so we've got an air expeditionary wing there. We moved our ANTPY-2 radar from Qatar to PSAB to gain further standoff because that is a battle management radar that is fundamental for our ability to fight in the region.
Outstanding. General, we've just got 2 minutes, so I'm going to take the privilege and ask you the last question. Again, it relates to another piece of your book. Years ago, 20 years ago, Dana Priest of the Washington Post wrote a great book about the combatant commanders. She called you folks proconsuls. I thought it was both a very accurate term and actually a very laudatory term, even though it often doesn't come off that way. You guys are the senior military, and because you are regional focused, you actually wind up being, to a great extent, the most important diplomatic leader that the United States has in these parts of the world, right? It gets this point that you talked about of the fusion of the political and the military at the senior level. Having been one of our proconsuls in one of the most important regions of the world, what should we think about that role and about how we conduct our military and diplomatic relations?
So anytime I ever entered a country, any country in the region, the first person I went to see was the U.S. ambassador to that country. And the first meeting I took was with that ambassador's country team. And then I might meet other people that are associated with the embassy that had information to give me. But I began with the U.S. ambassador because the ambassador is the president's representative to that country. And so I always felt it was very important to value the role of the ambassador. And often because of the nuances of operating in the region, typically if I'm going to come into a country, I'm going to meet the head of state. It may be hard sometimes, depending on the country and their anger at that moment against the United States, for the ambassador to see the head of state. But if I'm going in, the ambassador can come with me. Right. But what you got to do then is you've got to work very hard, and and the country, depending on the country, will like to split you off. They want to do business with the military. If it's foreign military sales, they want to talk. Sometimes not realizing that foreign military sales actually center of gravity for that's the Department of State, not the Department of Defense. We're just the executors. We make no decisions.
You're
for
going to
defense.
defend them.
But I'm going to defend them. So they want to. So I work very hard. That I think I really do believe you don't want to militarize foreign policy, and I don't want to. I think there's a grave temptation to do that, and you can get pushed into it by the people your interlocutors in any given country. And so I think it's incumbent on the military commander then to recognize the primacy of the ambassador and to work with the ambassador. I tried very hard to do that.
Outstanding. Ladies and gentlemen, I think that you have gotten at least a sense of the amount of wisdom contained in this slim volume. And again, it's so smooth, it's so well written, right? You will learn and you won't even realize you're learning as you read it. I hope you will buy it. I hope you enjoy it. Again, the General is going to sign copies over there. But first, please join me in thanking General McKenzie for sharing a little of his wisdom with us.
Thank you. Thank you.
That was